Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our webinar participants from around the world. Welcome to today's Devex webinar on how investors can drive gender equality in global development. My name is Karina Muhumaza, and I'm the Associate Director for Communications here at Devex. I'm looking forward to moderating this discussion today and hearing from our audience a bit later. Before we get started, I'd love to do a quick sound check to make sure that everyone can hear everything. If you can hear me, please type yes in the chat box. Wonderful. It looks like the audio is working fine, so we'll jump right in. 20% of global development organizations have 0 female leaders, a significant figure for an industry largely focused on gender programming and issues. How can development turn talk into action, and what role do investors have to play? Today, we'll be discussing just that. We'll be discussing root causes of gender inequality in leadership and how to spot them, practical guidance for building a more gender-equal leadership team, and strategies for investors to drive gender equality. We're fortunate to be joined by experts on this topic today. A quick introduction to our panelists. First, we have Marcia Ashong. Marcia is P&L and an organizational leader with a varied background in international energy, petroleum law, and extensive work experience in the upstream oil and gas industry, spanning 4 continents. She's worked on projects with the World Bank and is also the founder of the Ghana Oil Club, a professional organization aimed at a forum for petroleum and energy professionals. She was recently named among Ghana's 20 under 40 business leaders and is published with the Oxford Journal of World Energy Law. She's passionate about the opportunity to impact policy in the natural resource space, is an avid blogger and speaker on gender equality and the impact of women in leadership. Next, we have Tamsin Jones. Tamsin is a social entrepreneur who has been involved in the design and expansion of a string of high social impact new initiatives in Africa, the UK, Australia, and is a speaker and advisor on social innovation, entrepreneurship, and gender diversity. As the co-founder and executive director of the Boardroom Africa, she's delivering solutions to bring more exceptional female talent into the boardroom. Her career started as a policy advisor to the Premier of South Australia, and she has also served as a senior advisor to the leading innovator in the last mile cellular and internet connectivity and UK government's development finance institution, CDC Group. Tamsin also partnered with the V&A Waterfront to found South Africa's premier innovation and entrepreneurship hub, Workshop 17, which is a hive for new ideas and home to 250 entrepreneurs in a coding academy. Next, we have Nick O'Donoghue, who joined the CDC Group as its chief executive in June 2017 and is a member of the CDC board. He previously was a senior advisor to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he specialized in the use of blended finance models to support the work of the foundation. Prior to taking this role, Nick co-founded with Sir Ronald Cohen, Big Society Capital, an independent financial institution established by the UK government as the world's first social investment bank. Previously, Nick has worked at JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. Nick served as the chairman of the UK Dormant Assessments Commission, which reported in March 2017. He's also a board member of the Global Impact Investing Network and deputy chairman of the Global Steering Group on Impact Investment. We're excited to be hearing from each of them today. Before we get started, I'd love to note that we have plenty of time to answer your questions at the end. You'll be able to enter questions using the chat box in the Ready Talk window. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar, and I'll be keeping track of them, and we'll try to get to as many as time allows. Additionally, if you have any technical problems during the webinar, please send a message through the chat box, and one of my colleagues will assist you. I also want to note that the slides from today's presentation will be sent to you in an email following the webinar. And with that, let's get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. It's great to be connected with you all today, and thanks for being able to join on such an important topic. First of all, I wanted to thank CDC as well for participating in this forum with us. It's incredibly critical that development finance institutions especially take a forward role in trying to advance gender diversity across the workplace and beyond. And over the past several months and close to a year, we've really seen the impact of the work that they're doing to advance this cause. And so we thank Nick and his team for being able to make this happen. So in general, I think from the Boardroom Africa perspective, we really want to ensure that we get the point across that gender diversity is merely more than just getting organizations to focus on the feel-good factor of including women in all categories of leadership and beyond. We wanted to make sure that we explain to participants especially that there's a good economic impact for advancing women, not only in Africa but across the globe, and that there's been a lot of research recently, mostly backed by organizations like the African Development Bank on the continent and McKinsey as well, and a number of other institutions who have really strictly looked at the impact of diversity at the top. If you look at Africa and you're looking at workplace gender diversity and the role of lack of diversity, there's lots of data to show that sub-Saharan Africa is losing approximately $105 billion annually. And this is an annual number as a result of lack of workplace diversity. And that's just the workplace alone. And I often use this figure. If you look at a lot of these countries across the continent, Africa, in my country, specifically Ghana, we have an infrastructure deficit of approximately $2.5 billion. If you split that number of $105 billion across all the African continent and all the countries, you're looking at approximately $2 billion to cover most of that infrastructure deficit. So there is a real economic impact for increasing diversity on boards. And I guess the Boardroom Africa's role has really been to ensure that we elevate the discourse, but also we put in practical measures and not just a talk shop for why the gender diversity should increase. So what we do is we work with leaders from across the continent and beyond, with leaders like CDC Group and other development finance institutions and private investors across the globe to really tackle the issue of lack of diversity on board. And you must be wondering why we've decided to focus primarily at the board level. Well, lots of data also backs this point up, which is that starting at the top really makes a difference, a trickle-down effect, so to speak. And so we know also the boards have the tendency to influence decision-making at the executive level. And so diverse boards really speak to how an organization can start to think about diversity on a strategic level and really on a realistic and impactful level as well. So over the past 2 years since founding the Boardroom Africa, we really developed a cohort, so to speak, of female leaders from across the continent representing more than 45 countries and growing, a majority of whom are based on the continent, but a number of whom are also dispersed across the continent, some African and some not. And the reason why we felt it was important to build this network of women, more importantly, is because we believe that there is a general understanding out there, or a myth, so to speak, that women are somehow, qualified women are somehow not available or they're not interested in these roles. And so we wanted to start by first dispelling that myth and have since developed this amazing network of senior management, senior executives and above, of leaders who come from a number of different industries, covering various different fields and divides, and all of whom have the goal of expanding their leadership and really making an impact at the board level.
Great. And we're going to also share a little bit more on how we're doing in terms of board representation across Africa. So here are some interesting statistics that show you how we're doing in terms of Southern, Eastern, West, and North Africa. As you can see, there's quite a big difference between Southern Africa at 20% and North Africa at 9%. Overall, Africa is hitting about 14% of women on boards, which compares to a global average of 13%. So it's actually doing okay. So we're not seeing Africa as a special case, but it is part of, I think, a broader movement and a shift we need to make towards improving diversity. When you look at different kinds of industries, you've got sort of pharmaceuticals and health. They're doing it around 20% on boards. They're doing okay. And you've got heavy industries that's around 10%. When you drill into these numbers a bit more deeply, 66% of companies have 0 or 1 woman on their board. So there are a lot of companies that don't have any representation, and we really want this to change. So one of our commitments is to double the number of women on boards across Africa, and we're going to talk a bit more about how we do that. But perhaps first I can start with the why. There's a lot of research reports out there, hundreds globally, that show a correlation between improved gender diversity on boards and performance. This should be of interest to everyone in business, and it should be of interest to investors. But quite often, these types of statistics, you really aren't getting the kind of traction that they should be getting in terms of leadership in business. So 1 in 3 CEOs across Africa says that gender diversity is a priority. With the kind of performance benefits, we should be seeing 100% of CEOs doing this. So just to give you a couple of top line, so companies with improved gender diversity on their board have higher operating margins, a higher return on equity, and a higher overall return to shareholders. A recent report by McKinsey showed that companies that had 25% of women on their boards had EBITDA margins of 20% higher than the industry average. So there's no question on the research. This is something that everyone should be thinking about and that is good for business.
Thank you so much, Tamsin. And so as just to piggyback off of what Tamsin just said, we realize all these issues, but really just to give you a top-level overview of some of the concerns that really, and some of the barriers that really keep women from advancing. As you can see, we've laid them out quite clearly here. We're not saying this is an exhaustive list by all means, but these are some of the really major issues that have come across through research and other various platforms. So firstly, there's a lack of diversity at the top from senior management and the board, and that has an effect really of kind of closing networks and allowing the same people to be replicated on boards over and over again. There's lack of training and development to build and sustain the platform, and we'll talk more after this slide about how the Boardroom Africa and CDC Group are working to continue to build this pipeline. There's a prevailing narrative, as I said in my previous submission, that women are just not good at leadership, and or there seems to be a bias about what talent exists in terms of women leadership. We've lacked the ability to really create enough women role models for those women coming up in the pipeline. There's a coaching and mentorship issue as well to address. So how many women are actually taking on the role, and even men? How do we get men involved to be taking on the leadership agenda of women? And also, from our perspective, and the reason why we started this company to begin with, is the realization that the executive search industry and or the talent industry is really not addressing this concern. So moving on, we've also, as you can see, I mean, this slide just demonstrates our pipeline in terms of the number of women in our network and the caliber and the different walks of life that they come through. So the next slide really is a breakdown of how the Boardroom Africa has been structured to tackle some of those issues that we just saw. So the first thing we started to work on was really researching and mapping the market. Mapping the market by understanding exactly what the challenges were in the executive search world, but also understanding through data what the implications of lack of diversity was. So I'll give an example of that. The Boardroom Africa over the past year and a half has really built a database of research looking at board leadership, especially at starting with the listed boards across the African region. So looking at the stock exchange, looking at the companies in the stock exchange, and really determining country by country how gender plays a role. And we obviously share this data as they become available, and we're happy to also share the link to this on our website. We've created this talent community, which is a network of over 400 women we've discovered and growing. We've actively promote our members. So there is an element of search and placement in the work that we do, but before we even commence that process, we ensure that we're constantly sharing the profiles of our members and of our community to the wider world, including our partners and clients. We do training and development. So we've designed several programs. Our flagship programs are an Open Doors program, which is an accredited board leadership program, which we've partnered with CDC to develop, and a search and placement, which is another component which directly matches these participants and these members with active board opportunities. And we must say, in a short period of time, we've been very successful in delivering this agenda.
One of the things that's really important to us at the Boardroom Africa is to have a social impact, to truly scale this. So we have all of these initiatives. Why do we do it? Because we think that it's imperative, and we live in a time of race consciousness, and we want to scale this. And we can't do it without partners, and partners that have significant capital that they can deliver and deploy into the market. So it's for us, these partnerships with investors, that's going to make a real difference. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Nick to talk a bit more about CDC and their commitment in this area.
Thank you, Tamsin, and good afternoon, everybody. So it's a pleasure to be here on this call and talk about CDC's gender policy and also our relationship with Boardroom Africa. I think, as you know, CDC is a development finance institution. We're an investment institution. So the first reason, and I think Tamsin and Marcia both made this point very clearly, the first reason that we do this is because we believe that diversity makes a difference to company performance and therefore investment performance. It leads to better decision making. It leads to the introduction of sort of new and different diverse perspectives. It provides wider representation for company shareholders, and ultimately leads to improved shareholder value and better corporate governance. And that's true in all companies. It's true, of course, particularly in companies where customers are female or employees are more female dominated. But really, to say it's true in every company, and it's not just having women as part of a business at every level of the business is not really, from an investor perspective, a nice to have. It's essential, we think, for commercial performance. So how can we as an investor make use of our governance powers to really have an influence? And one way is obviously to help investees achieve gender-balanced boards and management teams, and that's where over the last year since we began the relationship with Boardroom Africa, that's been a very important part of what we do. We've done with them, and they've helped us to do. Secondly, we can promote more access to finance for women and for women entrepreneurs. And there's lots and lots of evidence around the world that women entrepreneurs are underrepresented in venture capital, and so we'd like to try and change that. At the individual job level and employment level, we can ensure that there are more jobs, better jobs for women. And at the product level, which we also think is important, ensuring the products and services, particularly in the markets in which we're investing, really serve and are designed for women. So we try to look along all these different issues. We launched our gender strategy this year to focus our focus our investing in these key areas. As part of that strategy, together with the other G7 DFIs at the recent G7 meeting in Canada. We launched an initiative called the 2X Challenge, which commits those development finance institutions to investing up to $3 billion in businesses that support women, and to do that by 2020. We're also, CDC'S played a leading role with OPIC in bringing that group together and getting that commitment made, and we're leading a working group now among DFIs to ensure that we have the right sort of frameworks and the right analysis and deals, that we build evidence and we disseminate case studies so that more non-development finance institutions can hopefully follow in our lead. And as I said, our relationship with Boardroom Africa is a critical part of that whole initiative. So on Boardroom Africa specifically, we've had that. We've been partners for the last year. Our mission is to try to help help them identify great board members, female board members for businesses in Africa, and hopefully place them onto boards. We have obviously some influence in the sense that as an investor, we generate demand for board memberships among our businesses. And on the other side, Boardroom Africa have, as they talked about, this now very broad network of outstanding women candidates around the continent. So we're both, if you like, a user of the service in terms of placing women on boards, and also hopefully we help to some extent through our 700 or so companies in Africa that we're invested in directly or indirectly. We help them to build a network, and specifically, Boardroom Africa has helped us on a number of different searches. I suppose all were important, but most important for us was our own board search, in which we recently appointed 2 new members from the African continent to the board of CDC, and Boardroom Africa played a critical role in identifying those candidates. So that's, I suppose, I'll close just by talking a bit about my personal experience. I was in Sierra Leone last week, and I met a number of companies that we have invested in, and there are at least, I met with a school chain called Rising Academies that we have invested in through a fund called Solon, where the school chain in Sierra Leone is run by a woman, and who is doing a fantastic job. I met with Miro Forestry, which is the one picture shown on this slide, where have a small, it's a forestry business we started supporting about 4 years ago. They're planting trees in deforested areas in rural Sierra Leone. They're providing up to 1,000 jobs for people in the neighborhood. And again, one of their senior, they're led by one of their senior leaders is a woman who is responsible for ensuring that the company is both protecting the environment, because obviously there are important environmental issues with forestry plantation, but also equally importantly helping with a workforce. A large part of managing a workforce is largely women, or a large part of which is women, and also working with the communities, because as you'll be aware, this type of plantation is enormously valuable for the local communities, provides lots of jobs which didn't otherwise exist, but at the same time there are significant issues around land issues, water issues, which need to be addressed, and it's obviously important for the company to play a role in providing health and support for education, support for housing, and so on in these areas. So I think that's another example where a woman leader is making a significant difference to our portfolio. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. I've seen a lot of questions coming in from the audience, so now I'd like to take the time to open up our conversation to the audience Q&A. If you have any questions, please submit it through the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So I'll kick off with the first question, and I believe this is one that the presenters touched on a bit, but how can men be more involved in promoting gender equality? What are some practical takeaways and tips?
I think you go, Marcia.
Thank you. That's a great question, and I think this is something that we often talk about, and it's a favorite question of ours for several reasons. We just don't believe that we can do this without the involvement of men. It's just impossible. Men make up majority of leadership, and so we have to actively find ways, positive ways, to get men to be involved in the leadership agenda of women. So oftentimes when we have these discussions, depending on who we're speaking to, there are various different angles to answer this question. But from the Boardroom Africa perspective, the first thing we've done in order to get men involved is really through our endorsement model. And by that, we mean we reach out to senior executives across the globe. We don't just focus on Africa in terms of finding talent, because anybody in any parts of the world can find talent, but obviously our main markets are in Africa and parts of Europe and South Asia. So we reach out to these individuals who are obviously quite influential, not only at the board level, but also at the executive level. And we say, look, this is the criteria of the type of women we're trying to reach out to. We want to expand our network. We want to ensure that these women get the exposure they need. So we give you this official title as an endorser of the Boardroom Africa, and your goal is to actively continue to promote the women in your network by introducing us to these women. And just that element alone has been so critical to the growth of our network that I would like to say that the majority of the women in our network have been through these critical endorsements. And as a result, this has kind of spearheaded to another level of endorsements from the women themselves, who then come on board and say, look, I also know these women in my network who would be great addition to your team. So that's really from the Boardroom Africa level how we typically get men involved. But on a broader scale, and oftentimes I always use myself as an example, how I've been able to really grow in terms of my career progression was really through having sponsors and or mentors who were really backing my credentials at the level at which I wasn't playing at. And what I mean by that is, if you're in an organization in a junior role, having a sponsor, and I'm not saying mentor because I believe that those two are quite different. A sponsor really allows, it enables the organizational leadership to see the impact of the woman who may not be in such a high position by speaking directly to her value at a level where she can't play at just yet. So it's constantly keeping this woman and the agenda of the women and the work of the women within the organization at the lips of senior executives. And that, for me, has really helped me and was critical in helping me, and I'm sure Tamsin can also attest to elements of this in her career as well, has really helped us kind of move up the corporate ladder and other organizational settings in ways that we wouldn't have been able to achieve without. Other ways have been through really engaging men in understanding what it is that they find to be barriers, not only to gender diversity, but also barriers to them wanting to add more women to boards. So when we started thinking about, especially when you talk about training and development, and why it is that oftentimes women are more likely to be asked to have certain credentials before joining a board, we asked men because we felt that, again, a majority of these men were in senior leadership roles and are board members and tend to be board chairs. So we asked them and said, what would give you a good assurance as to giving a woman who's had little or no board experience a chance to succeed? And oftentimes we got really good feedback in the process that has helped us really define how we approach training and development from the Boardroom Africa lens. I don't know if Tamsin wanted to add anything else, and maybe Nick himself, since he's also male. But those are the points that I think really critical when we are discussing this issue of male involvement.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Marcia. Oh, we have a lot of questions to get through, but I think that is a great kind of starting place, and people can definitely reach out to you for more practical solutions. So if you don't mind, I'd like to move on to the next question. We have a question from Ella, who asks, how do you support women entrepreneurs on creating creative financing solutions such as development impact bonds and other blended and social finance? How does that process start for women?
So maybe I should answer that question. I mean, I think I don't think there's an enormous difference between supporting women entrepreneurs through venture capital or supporting them through development impact bonds. I mean, they're basically just different vehicles. So I don't think there's and again, most of my experience from CDC's perspective, the development impact bond market is really just beginning, and it's not an area we've invested in yet. I have more experience of the UK social impact bond market in the UK, which obviously now is a bigger market, and I think a number of the leaders in that field, Michelle Giddens, for example, who's a board member of CDC, have been women. So I don't think there's any. They're probably underrepresented as a group overall, as they are in most areas of investment. But I don't think there's any specific reasons why, or differences between, attracting funding for a development impact bond versus attracting funding for any other entrepreneurial idea.
Great, thank you, Nick. We have another question from McKinney. He asks, why start with boardrooms and not the C-suite? Are there plans to expand to that focus in the future?
I think for us it was important to start at the top. If you look at the statistics, 45% of the workforce and people entering the workforce are women. This is in South Africa, but it's pretty translated across any country. And then you get to the top end, it's 5%. And one of the things about the boardroom is that it sets the tone for a business. So if the boardroom is 50% women, it starts to have an influence on how that organization is thinking, the strategy, and their board terms are usually more regularly turning over and there's more opportunity. So for us, the key is how do we move this system as quickly as we can? And as Marcia mentioned, without the role models and without the stories, a lot of women aren't seeing that they're going to make it to the top and they're being discouraged. So for us, the boardroom is the way to, I guess, light the way for many women coming up through that environment. There's no doubt that there are challenges in the C-suite. There aren't the same numbers of men and women in those places. And if you're interested in more data on that, it's something the Boardroom Africa has been collecting in addition to board data. So you can see how, for example, how many CFOs, CEOs, and so forth are in Uganda or South Africa and elsewhere. But for us, the tipping point is in the boardroom, and we believe that will have a filter down effect across the rest of the organization.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Lindewe. I noticed we are making a business case for women in the private sector. Is there any evidence to support the same for women in the public sector and government and at various levels?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think in some ways, yes. Our focus has largely been in the private sector for various reasons. It doesn't require lobbying work on our part, and especially as a private entity, it's and not necessarily an advocacy-based institution. We wanted to make sure that we were very clear about what our goals were and what they weren't. But that doesn't negate from the fact that we are open to working with any board of any type across the continent, whether public, private, nonprofit, you name it, blue chip, listed, and across the globe. A number of our members have come from or are currently public sector officials, depending on what the requirements are when there's board availability. And the same principles in terms of how we promote women applies to the network of women that we work with. And it also applies when you're talking about how that impact can then be transferred to men within these public institutions and how they can support. So I think those lessons are always transferable. We don't have a preference, so to speak, as to the types of board opportunities that we seek. However, the public sector has a unique dispensation in the fact that board positions on state enterprises tend to be very well regulated in-house, and so finding ways to bridge that gap is critical. So I'll give you an example of some of the things that we're doing or potentially are able to do in that regard. We started working with having really serious discussions with the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, and have talked about potentially getting involved with them on being able to deliver certain advocacy-based approach to state organizations, especially state regulators and those that really manage who sits on state boards. So that's one active, I would say, active stance that we started to take in addressing the state end of things. But there's also obviously a lot of work to be done, and we're happy to be working with various partners in order to identify those other opportunities where we can get involved.
Great, thank you. Another question from Beverly. Has there been any experience with the lack of collateral for loans by women entrepreneurs, and how has support been facilitated?
Yeah, so let me try to take that one on the question of collateral. I mean, look, I think if you look at products which have been developed specifically or with women in mind, I mean, or women sort of as the lead market, I think financial products, microfinance particularly, has been a very successful story over the last 20, 25 years, and that started really focused on women and self-help groups. I think to some extent that was an attempt to get it to address this issue of banks lending, principally lending when they make loans or being prepared to make loans only against collateral, and typically, particularly in the countries in which we work in, women don't typically control the collateral. But I mean, I think it really is about making more flexible, if you like, unsecured lending available, often in smaller amounts in the countries that which we typically do through our banking partners, which goes some way towards addressing this issue.
Great, thank you. There's also a question here about cultural barriers in Africa in particular, just thinking about perceptions with women who hold high positions and women that sit on boards. How have you addressed some of the cultural barriers that exist around women in leadership?
I think this is a really interesting question. We quite often speak to women who in our mind are absolutely exceptional and at the top of their game, but they don't want to always promote themselves. And it's a question we always ask is why? You know, why is it difficult to put your head up in those situations? And there is some really interesting research that underpins this. So there's research that shows that men are understood to be able to take charge. And so when a man takes charge, it's seen as being kind of good leadership and strong. And women are expected culturally and traditionally to take care. And so when women take care, they're well understood, and that seems, normal, and everyone's comfortable with that. When they take charge, it's seen as being different. And quite often, women in that situation are not well liked. They experience challenges. So I think there is a dynamic there. And I think we have to be really clear on this. If 95% of CEOs and 85% of people on boards are men, these women are ruffling a few feathers. It's not an easy thing to stand up there and to say, I own this is my space, this is my leadership journey. And so I think we have to, as organizations, as investors, as CEOs, not just look at what are the structures and the issues that I'm seeing in terms of numbers, but what are the cultural dynamics that underpin that? Are there women in my organization who aren't putting their hand up to say, I want to do this because they're feeling like they're experiencing a negative reaction? And I think Marcia spoke a little bit to the importance of sponsorship. There's some research that shows it'll take 60 years potentially for women to reach equality in terms of the workforce, and we can't wait that long. So we need to be telling these stories more regularly, and we need to be structuring and supporting women to stand up and to be supported by their organizations. And we think this is critically important.
Great. There's also a question here about what is the current atmosphere across Africa for women in entrepreneurship programs or programs supporting female entrepreneurship?
Could you repeat that question? I didn't quite catch it.
Yes, not a problem. There's a question here about the atmosphere for female entrepreneurship across Africa. What does that kind of scene look like for female entrepreneurship? Are there programs already in place to kind of support women and encourage women in entrepreneurship?
Yeah, it's expanding. I think it's, we've talked about the 2X initiative and other things. I think the awareness is there. There's actually a recent piece of research came out yesterday from the Social Innovation Review that showed that women-led early-stage businesses were experiencing greater profitability but receiving less investment. So there is a way to go globally, but as we're saying, the research is really trending in that direction. If you look at a lot of countries around the world, there are more women leading small businesses than men. This is really something that I think investors should be backing, and there is significant growth. There are a number of accelerators that are popping up around the world to support women, and I think these are really important. But the capital also really needs to grow in response to that, and we need to think, we talked about the cultural factors and dynamics. There's a lot of challenges in the early stage investing space around women getting access to those funds, but there's no doubt it's changing and it's growing for the better.
Great. The audience would like to know a little bit more about learnings that you've had from other continents on Boardroom, gender balance and women's success. How can some of the learnings that you've had and the success that you've had with the Boardroom Africa, how can that be replicated in other contexts?
Good question. So oftentimes, and this also kind of piggybacks to the point of why a lot of people ask us why not focus at the executive level. And we don't see why this can't be done. We have had great success, although in a very short period of time, we still have a long way to go. But all the learnings that we have had can easily be replicated at the senior executive level as well as the senior management level. And so we hope that over time we'll be able to expand our services to cover those areas and also expand to different markets. In fact, on that second point, in expanding to different markets, we've already began the work of scoping out other emerging markets to see how best we can also implement our services at that level. If you look at CDC, for instance, their markets are mostly Africa and South Asia, so that's really given us an impetus to really look at what the capabilities are in that part of the world and also look at potentially being able to provide our services there. So I think all the work that we're doing, and we constantly gather data, but in all the work that we do, we ensure that we are collecting information, that we're documenting our successes, our failures as well, our challenges, and in fact, all of this will allow us to continue to build a system that is constantly changing to reflect the realities and also very responsive to any challenges that we may come across. So I think that's that in a nutshell. And in terms of what other regions are doing, it's quite a lot. I think the reason why the Boardroom Africa was also started was because a lot of institutions, mostly in the West, in Europe and in the Americas, have done so much work in this area. And we just felt that there was a gap missing in the African continent. So a lot of our solutions that we have built, although they've been very kind of customized for this market, has been really based on some of the learnings we've seen from some of the organizations across the globe.
Great. We have time for one last question. There's a question here about language, taking into account that language often can provide an additional barrier to some African women leaders. Most of the African women in boardrooms are coming from English-speaking countries. Are there specific actions towards non-English speaking women in terms of training and making trainings available to those women?
I think language is a critical issue as well as exposure. Not all of these countries have the same level of exposure. So in terms of selecting for the Boardroom Africa and finding exceptional women for our network, we use the collective intelligence of our members. They know these women in these countries. CDC is very regularly investing in some of these economies that are less known. And so for us, it's critical. And as Marcia mentioned earlier, we cover 45 countries in terms of our membership. Obviously, they're also outside of Africa, but African-oriented individuals. In terms of training, we're rolling out our first Open Doors accredited board training in January of this year, and that will be in English, but we are absolutely planning on covering the continent. So we'll be hoping to roll that out in at least Francophone countries, probably not next year, but we will be looking at doing that because it's really important, and certainly our membership does reflect that. But I would sort of say to people who come from different countries, we are working with a range of investors. We're working with some of CDC's funds and other funds of other major investors from around the globe. So there are opportunities in markets that are near you. And I really would encourage everyone to reach out, let us know that they're out there, and see how we can support them.
And if I might just quickly add, I know that this is the last question, and as a West African as well, I'm very closely surrounded by Francophone African countries. This is a critical problem, and I've also lived in a Francophone country, so I know that this is really an issue that cuts across the continent. From our perspective, one thing that we do is we're very conscious about being able to split the number of women in our network across the various, I'll say language barriers. Looking at making sure that we have enough women in the Francophone world, as well as making sure there are enough women also from the Lusophone world, because there's also another a language bracket, and the Spanish world as well, because there are quite a few, one or two countries on the continent who are also leaning that direction. So I would safely say that we do a really good job at tapping into Francophone through our various networks. We haven't yet developed a multi-language approach, although that's something, as Tamsin said, that we're looking to do, and we're open to discussing further with partners who can help us achieve that. But in terms of representation of women from these markets and those women that we promote for board opportunities, that's always been in our radar, and we continue to do a lot of work around that.
Great. Thank you so much. So before we wrap up this webinar, I'm going to hand it back over to Marcia and Tamsin once again to talk through some final takeaways and calls to action.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I'll give a couple of takeaways and then I'll hand it over to Marcia. I would say to those listening, you need to make gender diversity a top board and CEO priority. If 1 in 3 CEOs right now have it as a priority, that's something we need to shift if we're going to move the needle. We need to anchor our gender diversity strategies in a compelling business case. There is research out there. We quite regularly get people saying to us, I'm a CEO, I want to tell my board I need more women, how do I do it? There is a business case. If you're not sure about what it is, reach out to us. Really think through what are the pervading attitudes in your organizations or in your investing strategy that you can shift, because they're as critical as the structures, and build in the structures, build in sponsorship programs. Don't leave it up to people to make the decision. Make it a point of pride that your organization is ensuring that women are being promoted and are able to reach the top of your organization and into your boardroom.
very good point, Tamsin. I think I'm not going to add further to that. And I think it would be really great to hear from Nick as a closing, to hear his thoughts also as to what he thinks, especially from an investor perspective, how we can move forward.
So thank you all. Just from my perspective, thank you all for dialing in, and again to reinforce both CDC's commitment broadly to our gender strategy, which is obviously available on our website, and I'd encourage you all to look at, and also our support for Boardroom Africa. I think there's an enormous potential, an enormous sort of depth of talent in Africa that we can help, I think, position for boardroom positions across the whole continent. So again, thank you all. It's been a pleasure for me to participate in this.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we've come to an end of our scheduled time for this webinar, and I want to take the time to thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope that you've enjoyed this conversation. Once you exit the webinar, a survey will appear in your browser. You can just take 2 minutes. We would really appreciate your feedback about this webinar and your ideas for future events. If you would like to watch the webinar again, we will be emailing it to you shortly and posting it on Devex.com. So look out for that in the near future. This is also where you'll be able to find articles that we've referenced today. Again, a big thank you to Marcia, Tamsin, and Nick for taking the time to speak with us today and share their knowledge and inspire us. On behalf of Devex, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in, and I hope that you'll join us for our next digital event.